The world of Red Dead Redemption 2 is so large, so detailed and varied, so full of stories and inspirations, so many things to talk about. I've already made a video looking at the historical accuracy of Red Dead Redemption 2 from a broad perspective, but I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. There are so many events, items, locations, so many people, expressions and traditions, and I want to know more about all of them. So, starting all the way back at the beginning, this is the real history of Red Dead Redemption 2. The game's opening text is entirely accurate. By the end of the 19th century, the Old West was nearing its end. The 1890 US Census showed that the frontier had nowhere else to conquer. The Civil War was over, and laws were commonplace. Some gangs still roamed, but they were being hunted down and destroyed. In fact, a lot of gangs were ultimately destroyed around the turn of the century. When we first see the gang, they're moving wagons with horses, which of course is entirely historically accurate. Horses were domesticated thousands of years before the game's setting, and horse-drawn carriages have been used for just about as long. The state in which the Van der Linde gang are travelling, Ambarino, could be based on any number of Rocky Mountain states, like Idaho, Montana, or Wyoming, though it's most likely based on Colorado, both because of its geographical placement, specifically Colorado's placement near New Mexico and Texas, and its name. In Spanish, Colorado means red, and Ambarino means amber. Not to mention that the state's recently revealed flag bears a striking resemblance to the 1907 to 1911 Colorado state flag. In this opening cutscene, Hosea complains about the snowstorm.
This weather, it's May!
Despite Hosea's apparent confusion about the weather, however, snowstorms in this region, namely the Colorado valleys, were said to be pretty common in May, though apparently not in 1899 when the game is set. One newspaper claims that the preceding winter was heavy with snowfall, but not May 1899. That being said, there was apparently at least one snowstorm in the region in May. On the 2nd of the month, a snowstorm hit the northern town of Windsor, Colorado, forcing a ball game to be postponed until the following week. By the sounds of it, maybe not strong enough to have such a strong impact on the Van der Linde gang, but significant nonetheless. Eventually, the Van der Linde gang settled down in Coulter, a mining town that was abandoned during a storm 15 years prior. Now, the mining industry boomed about 50 years before the events of the game, during and after the California Gold Rush in 1848. After about 10 years of mining, California began to wane, and by the 1860s, prospectors were moving towards the mountains. Colorado in particular experienced an enormous boom after the discovery of silver at Leadville in 1879. Around 1893, however, the price of silver dropped rapidly, and several years of depression in the state followed. Mining towns were abandoned. In fact, in the 1990s, more than 18,000 abandoned mines were identified in Colorado alone. Interestingly, it appears that the abandonment of Coulter in Red Dead Redemption 2 is not due to the price of silver or any other metals, it's due to heavy snow. It's not the only mining town to have suffered such an incident around this time though. On December 21st, 1883, a boarding house for the Virginius mine outside of Ouray, Colorado was swept over by an avalanche, resulting in at least 6 deaths. However, unlike Coulter, the mine, owned by the Carolina Mining Company, was not abandoned. It had 35 employees at the time of the accident, and so it continued to operate, eventually becoming known as the Revenue Mine. Also in 1883, a 23-day blizzard in Animas Forks, Colorado could have led to a similar fate. The blizzard blanketed the town with 25 feet of snow, forcing the locals to dig tunnels simply to move between buildings. Despite this major setback, the mine continued to grow for several years, and in 1904, the Gold Prince Mill was constructed. Eventually, however, it suffered the same fates as most mining towns of the time. The mill ceased operation in 1910, and in 1917, miners removed its major parts for use in a new mill in Eureka. By the 1920s, Animas Forks was a ghost town. 100 years later, it still is. The fate of Coulter may not be an exact replica of a real-life event then, but it certainly could have been inspired by many. The next few scenes in this mission have more interesting, though often obvious, historical connections. For example, the gang used fuel-burning lanterns to light their path, and this is an item that Arthur can use all throughout the game. Coil oil lamp, which uses kerosene or petroleum-based lubricants, was created by John H. Irwin in 1862, replacing the lanterns of the 1700s, which were lit with the more expensive whale oil or sperm oil. Prior to this, lanterns were essentially just fancy candle holders. After the gang settle in the building and discover that Davy has died, they put coins over his eyes. It's often believed that this ritual dates back to the ancient Greeks, but there's actually only one known occurrence of this happening in Judea around the 2nd century AD. In reality, the coin was placed in or on the mouth of a dead person as a payment or bribe for the ferryman who transported them from the world of the living to the world of the dead. In slightly more modern times, in Gaelic-speaking areas like Ireland or Scotland, placing coins on the eyes of a dead person was more of a practical task than a religious one. It was used to stop the eyes from springing open to muscular contraction. Eventually, this version of the tradition made its way to the Old West, and evidently to the Van der Linde gang. Nowadays, however, morticians simply glue the eyes shut or use eye caps to hold the eyelids in place. When Arthur, Dutch and Micah make their way to the Adler Ranch, they tether their horses to a hitching post. These, of course, were very common during the time period. They were essentially the parking spaces of their time. They likely originated in Europe in the 1600s, and when they made their way to the US, were typically made of stone or wood. Charles Busch of Newbury, New York, was issued the first patent for the hitching post in 1861, followed by others for the next few decades by many more patents and many different designs. And by the end of the 19th century, they were as common as they are in the game. Interestingly, there's a story from Kansas City, Missouri in July 1899, in which city forester L.F. Timmig believed that the addition of more hitching posts in Kansas City would result in fewer injured trees. So one can imagine that their popularity was only growing at this time. Once inside the homestead at the Adler Ranch, Dutch and Arthur begin looking for supplies. One of the places Arthur searches is the medicine chest. For centuries before the game, people would store their medicines and cosmetics in a chest or pantry, often in or near the bedroom, to protect them from bugs, rodents, and children. It wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s that the bathroom became the more prominent location, particularly in shelves hanging on the wall. There's a promotion from 1845 advertising the sale of medicine cabinets for $5.50, the equivalent of around $190 today. In 1894, an advertisement claimed that every family should have one. So by 1899, it's no surprise that the Adlers were one of these families. All of the supplies that Dutch and Arthur come across are based on reality too. Oatcakes, known in the game as classic oatcakes, existed in Scotland as early as the 1st century during the Roman conquest of Britain, and they eventually made their way to Canada via Scottish immigrants in the late 18th century. It's highly feasible for them to have moved from Canada to the US sometime over the next 200 years before the events of the game too. The canned fruit and vegetables are most certainly historically accurate. In 1795, as the country was involved in several battles around the world, the French government offered a cash reward to anyone who could invent an effective and cheap way of preserving food in large quantities. Enter French confectioner Nicolas Appert, who observed that food packed into airtight champagne bottles did not decay. He soon progressed to glass containers. In 1810, British merchant Peter Durand patented his own method, said to have actually been created by Frenchman Philippe de Girard, though this time packed within a tin can. Thus, modern-day canning was born. On that note, Arthur picks up a can of baked beans in the homestead too. Interestingly, the timing on this one is relatively tight, though not entirely implausible. The origin of baked beans can be traced back to Native Americans, but the first example of mass-produced commercial baked beans in cans is in 1895 by the H.J. Heinz Company in Pennsylvania, 4 years before the game is set. In Colorado specifically, there's mention of some Heinz products making their way there in 1897, and a wider range in 1898. But there's no mention of beans specifically until 1902, 3 years after the game. Who knows, maybe the Adlers got their hands on canned baked beans earlier than the wider public, or maybe Rockstar just isn't as annoyingly pedantic as I am. Speaking of which, salted beef, which Arthur finds on the table in the homestead, has an interesting history. Salting meat is theorized to date back to ancient times when it was discovered that in cold areas, meat didn't spoil when it had enough salt. However, nobody really has salted beef anymore. They have corned beef, named by the British in the 17th century due to the size of the salt used to cure it. Interestingly, corned beef can be consumed in the game, but only in cans, and we already know about those. Finally, Arthur takes money from a coin purse found in a chest. Versions of coin purses have existed for thousands of years, potentially dating back to 3300 BCE. though the design of the one found in the homestead is a reflection of the typical designs of the time, demonstrating class. While in the house, Dutch refers to Uncle Sam.
Wanting Colm dead is about the only thing me and Uncle Sam agree on.
This isn't the last time we hear Dutch refer to his estranged uncle either, but of course we're not talking about a relative of Dutch. No, Uncle Sam refers to the United States, or more specifically the federal government. The origin of the name is disputed, though a common story is that it's based on Sam Wilson, a meat packer from New York, who supplied food rations during the War of 1812 to American soldiers. When somebody asked what the labels on one of the cans stood for, a worker joked that the US stood not for United States, but for Uncle Sam, and the nickname remained. However, there's evidence of the term being used as early as 1810, so this story may be entirely false. The nickname was really popularized when it was personified by a well-known recruitment poster during the First World War in 1917, but there's no reason why Dutch wouldn't have known the meaning of the name in 1899. At the end of the first mission, Micah complains about the living arrangements at camp, particularly his roommates.
Now how come Arthur gets a room and I get a bunk bed next to Bill Williamson and a bunch of darkies?
You may not have actually heard that last word before, because even in historical texts it's not very frequently used, but based on the context, it's easy to work out that it's a racial slur. It was first used around 1775, but at the time it may have actually been used without direct intention of offense. Some say that it might have even been a sentimental or affectionate term. For example, in the 1853 song, My Old Kentucky Home, Stephen Foster uses the term alongside the word gay, which at the time, of course, meant carefree or cheerful. But regardless of the intention behind the term at the time, it was still likely seen as offensive and patronizing to those to whom it referred. Why not just refer to them as people? Over time, particularly around the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the term became known as offensive and unacceptable, and this is almost certainly the intention behind Micah's usage in the game. In 1986, Stephen Foster's song, which by that time had become the official state song of Kentucky, underwent a change, replacing the offensive term with the word people whenever it was used officially by the government. Since then, the term has become nigh obsolete, and rightly so. In the second mission, Arthur and Javier save John and protect him from wolves. Grey wolves were fairly common around the Rocky Mountains in this time. In fact, there were attempts to exterminate them entirely in Wyoming. They made their way north of Fort Collins, Colorado in 1899, and attacks weren't uncommon. In Nebraska in 1899, Peter A. Watson was attacked by a grey wolf, but managed to kill it in close combat with a small revolver. Watson was a wolf hunter for the State Stock Association, killing an average of 400 grey wolves per year, that was closer to 200 per year by the turn of the century. In Colorado, the last wild wolf was shot in 1945, and it wasn't until last year, 2020, that an initiative was approved to finally reintroduce them back into the wild. Speaking of animals in the wild, one of the next missions involves hunting deer with Charles, but before that, Arthur speaks to Pearson, the camp's cook, who enjoys speaking of his time in the Navy.
When I was in the Navy.
I do not wish to hear about what you got up to in the Navy, Mr. Pearson.
Assuming that Pearson was born around the middle of the 19th century, he technically could have joined the Navy at the age of 14 with parental consent. This lines up with the end of the American Civil War, so he likely joined the force during the post-war period of decline. Perhaps this is the reason he had such a short stint in the Navy, or perhaps he just wasn't very suited for it, no matter what he says. As Arthur and Charles leave, Pearson gives them some assorted salted offal. Typically referred to as variety meats or organ meats in the United States, offal is the organs of a butchered animal. Unsurprisingly, it's not hugely popular to Americans, which might explain Arthur's reaction.
Starving would be preferable.
Before long, Arthur and Charles encounter some deer. This isn't surprising at all, as white-tailed deer are actually native to North America and are specifically distributed near the Rocky Mountains. Looking specifically at Colorado in 1899, they were spotted near Loveland in November after heavy storms in the mountains, seen in Rifle, Colorado and hunted in the western slope, and driven from Glen Beulah Park to be turned over to the state in October. On their way back to camp, Arthur and Charles almost run into a grizzly bear. This wouldn't be the only encounter in this area around the time. In May 1899, R.W. Bryan of Maybell, Colorado fought with a grizzly bear after the bear had killed a mountain lion and focused its attention on him. Sadly, by this time, the grizzly bear population was already in steady decline. Between 1850 and 1920, they were eliminated from 95% of their original range. In the North Cascades area in Washington, more than 3,700 grizzly bear hides were shipped from trading posts between 1827 and 1859. In Colorado, the grizzly bear was considered locally extinct in 1951. That is, until Ed Wiseman killed one with an arrow in his hand in September 1979 after being attacked and mauled by it. By this time, bears were protected by law, so an investigation followed, but it was eventually determined that he had acted in self-defense. Unfortunately, this was the final sighting of a grizzly bear in the wild in Colorado. When Arthur and Charles return to camp, Pearson shares his drink with them, and Arthur is in for a shock.
Jesus, what is that?
Navy rum, sir. It's the only thing. The only thing.
Based on the actual properties of Navy rum though, Arthur's reaction is not at all surprising. In 1794, when the US Navy was officially established, it inherited the British Royal Navy's tradition of providing sailors with a daily rum ration. In the UK, the rum was 57% alcohol by volume. A standard modern beer is usually around 4 to 6%. So when you hear the term Navy strength, you know what it means. Sailors were originally given about half a pint of distilled spirits, reduced to a quarter pint in 1842, and to nothing during the Civil War in 1862. That won't stop Pearson from drinking on the job though.
Boys, because I thought you liked action. A couple of days on the lam, and you lot have all turned yellow.
Let's break down what Micah says here. In a modern context, on the lam refers to fugitives on the run, and it makes more sense when it's pulled apart. To lam is to beat, and to beat it in Old English means to leave. So on the lam is essentially on the leave or on the run. In 1938, a New York police officer claimed to have heard the phrase about 30 years prior, which would be around 1908, far later than the game's 1899 setting. However, Cabaret Society apparently used the word lam around 1900, so it's feasible that it was in use during the game, though I doubt Micah attends cabaret shows, so how he learned of its meaning is beyond me. As for turning yellow, the source of yellow and yellow belly meaning coward is unclear, though it may date back to the 13th century, when heretics who repented were forced to wear yellow crosses. It wasn't until 1856, however, that the word first appeared in print as a synonym for coward. As P.T. Barnum wrote, "We never thought your heart was yellow." 13 years prior, the Wisconsin Inquirer quoted Captain Wright of New York using the term yellow belly to refer to Mexicans, though it's more likely that this referred to their uniform or was intended as racist rather than meaning cowardly. The actual etymology of the term yellow belly, however, might be based on the fact that those with yellow guts, and thus are yellow-bellied, have fake courage, as guts began to mean courageous around 1893. Regardless, it's safe to say that Micah was likely well aware of the term yellow by 1899, probably been called it a few times himself. When the gang arrive at the O'Driscoll's camp, Arthur observes them through his binoculars. This piece of equipment has an interesting history, tracing all the way back to Hans Lippershey, the first person to file a patent for the telescope in 1608. Lippershey was asked to build a binocular version of the telescope, which he reportedly did later that year, but they were criticised for the lack of efficacy. Several other attempts were made over the next 200 years, but it wasn't until 1811 that the drawbacks were corrected by Johann Friedrich Voigtlander with the binocular opera glasses. The first pair of binoculars that we're familiar with were invented by J.P. Lemire in 1825. Another design that you might be familiar with is the Porro or prison design, invented by Ignacio Porro in 1854, though you won't use these in the game. Inside the O'Driscoll camp, Arthur and Bill find a large stash of dynamite, which also has an interesting history. In France, Alfred Nobel studied under a chemist, whose other pupil, Ascanio Sobrero, was the first to synthesize nitroglycerin in 1847. Over time, Nobel, along with his father and brother, experimented with nitroglycerin, and he performed the first successful detonation in 1863. He originally sold it as Nobel's blasting power, but changed it to dynamite based on the ancient Greek word dynamis, meaning power. The Giant Powder Company was incorporated in San Francisco in August 1867 to manufacture dynamite, having obtained the exclusive rights from Nobel, and thus it made its way to the United States, and 30 years later, into the hands of the O'Driscolls and stolen by the Van der Linde gang. Towards the end of the mission, Arthur uses his lasso to capture Kieran. Interestingly, the history of the lasso may date back as far as around 1280 BCE, when carvings in Europe showed the pharaoh holding a lasso. A few thousand years later, Native Americans were said to have used lassos in the battle against Spanish conquistadors, and when the Spanish introduced horses to the New World, the Native Americans improved their ability by learning to attack on horseback. A few hundred years later, and Arthur seems to have mastered it himself. In the next mission, the gang prepare to rob a train. Bill sets up the dynamite below the railway bridge, and Arthur helps him connect the wire to the detonator. This method is basically as old as dynamite itself. In 1864, Alfred Nobel realized that nitroglycerin cannot be detonated by a fuse, but it could be detonated by the explosion of a small charge of gunpowder, which could be detonated by a fuse. Not far from the planned detonation spot, above the railway track, is a water tower. Elevated water storage tanks have existed in some form since ancient times, but these modern railway towers were developed in the mid-19th century. The one in the game is a railroad water tank used to refill the boilers of steam locomotives on the line. They were originally placed every 7 to 10 miles and took a lot of time to refill, but with the introduction of special cars that could hold water and fuel, trains could soon run 100 to 150 miles without a refill. Interestingly, some settlements were built around water stops. Some locations were too insignificant for a regular train station, but the existence of a water stop in the town led to the nickname jerkwater towns. One notable example is the city of Coalinga, California. The name was developed from the title Coaling Station A, the original name of the coaling station established in 1888. Just before the train comes around the corner, the gang members pull up their bandanas to disguise their faces. The predecessor of the bandana, the kerchief, dates back centuries, but the bandana was popularized during the American Revolution, during which Martha Washington had a bandana made of her husband, General George Washington. As Arthur runs from the back of the train to the front, there are a few blink-and-you-miss-it items found in the carriages, all with an interesting history. The phonograph was actually fairly recent in 1899, having only been invented in 1877 by Thomas Edison and commercialized in 1888. The globe was much less recent, having been sold in the US since 1813. They were created by James Wilson of New Hampshire, who had taught himself map making after becoming interested in cartography. He opened the first geographic globe factory in the country, and his products were widely successful, but quite expensive, with the first 13-inch globe priced at $50, the equivalent of over $800 today. Even older than the globe is the harp. They've been known since antiquity in Africa, Asia, and Europe, dating back to as early as 3000 BCE. Another item dating back that far is the candle, but the candelabra is a bit more recent. Candle holders made of clay date back to 400 BCE, and it is understood that the candelabra was used during the Middle Ages from 400 to 1400 AD, though the earliest existing records date back to the 1600s. The invention of the light bulb in the 1870s somewhat diminished the need for the candelabra, though it appears that Cornwall must have maintained an affinity for them. Once Arthur breaks into Cornwall's private train car, he may find a letter signed by the Leyland Oil Development Company making note of the initial phase of exploration at the Wapiti Indian Reservation. Sadly, this was true for Native Americans of the time. Despite being moved from their ancestral lands to reservation sites, they still weren't safe. For example, petroleum developer Henry Foster received privileges from the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1895 to search the Osage Reservation in Oklahoma for oil and gas. There are a few more small items found in Cornwall's private car too. The cigar has its origins as early as the 10th century, with the ancient Mayans wrapping tobacco in a palm or plantain leaf to smoke, though the first Westerners to encounter tobacco in recorded history were Christopher Columbus and his men in 1492. By the mid-19th century, approximately 300 million cigars had been sold. The pocket watch evolved in the 17th century from the earlier clock watches, as men began to wear them in their pockets instead of as pendants, partly due to fashion, but mostly because it kept them safe from the elements. Brandy was first distilled in France in the 14th century, though production in the United States really began in the 18th century, and it became truly popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Fine brandy, as Arthur finds, typically refers to high-quality French brandy, which might seem out of place here, but considering Cornwall's riches, it's not entirely surprising. Cigarette cards were rather new at the time, having been introduced in the mid-1870s by the US-based tobacco company Allen & Ginter. They were collectible cards often included with packages of cigarettes, and released according to themes, including film stars, sports athletes, nature, and military heroes. Taxidermy is said to have been around in some form as early as 2200 BCE, when ancient Egyptians embalmed the bodies of animals of royalty and buried them within the tomb of their pharaoh. Modern-day taxidermy in the United States began in 1861, when the Natural Science Establishment was founded in New York, placing the practice on the same level as other works of art and into the public eye. The last and most valuable item that Arthur collects from the private mail car are some bearer bonds. These are government or corporate issued instruments of debt that are unregistered with no listing of the owner's names. They were first introduced to the United States in the late 1800s to fund reconstruction after the Civil War, but by the 20th century became virtually unused as they offered no protection from loss or theft, and in 1982 they were essentially outlawed by the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act. There are a lot of individual historical items found throughout this mission, but the most interesting comparison to be made is actually of the train robbery itself. In many ways, it's an homage to the 1899 Wilcox train robbery in Wyoming, likely orchestrated by Butch Cassidy and his gang, the Wild Bunch. The beginning of the heists are quite different. One of Butch's men waved down the train while Arthur and Lenny dive aboard theirs to stop it themselves. But the similarities become clearer when it comes to the opening of the mail car. In both cases, the men inside the cars refused to exit, forcing the robbers to riddle the carriage with bullets and blow open the doors. It was at this point in Butch's robbery when a second train began to bear down on them, so he eventually got the engineer to move down another mile or so, just beyond a newly constructed bridge. When the train stopped, Butch placed 10 pounds of giant powder beside the track and lit the fuse. Like in the game, the bridge remained in place, though in Butch's case an explosion actually occurred, and the bridge appeared fairly unpassable. Butch and his gang blew open the second mail car in both its safes, and at around 3:30 AM walked away with about $50,000 in cash, coin, and jewellery. Or at least that's one version of the story. Whether or not Butch was directly involved in the robbery is somewhat disputed, but considering Dutch's involvement in the in-game robbery, it appears that it's this version of events that Rockstar decided to follow. Regardless, the millionaire who ran the Union Pacific, E.H. Harriman, read the news report about the robbery and hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to track down the Wild Bunch. It appears that Leviticus Cornwall, the millionaire who owned the train in the game, has the same idea. Early in the next mission, the last one of Chapter 1, Arthur, Charles, and Hosea encounter some Native Americans from a distance. Hosea tells Arthur of their troubles.
Stole them clean away from them, it was, every blade of grass. Killed or herded up to the reservations in the middle of nowhere.
Sadly, this is very much true. The Indian Removal Act, signed into law in May 1830 by President Andrew Jackson, authorized the president to negotiate with southern Native American tribes for their removal to federal territory, also known as reservations. As expected, however, these negotiations were full of corruption and laden with coercion. One of the more brutal examples in the Trail of Tears was the removal of the Cherokee Nation from their lands, conducted through a treaty that was not approved by the Cherokee National Council nor signed by the nation's principal chief. Despite this, the government ratified it anyway, and the removal ultimately resulted in at least 4,000 deaths, equating to 1/5 of the Cherokee population, but likely even more.
I just heard some of the army out here was particularly unpleasant about it.
Unfortunately, Hosea is right about this too, though the unpleasantness certainly wasn't restricted to any one area. Of the approximately 100,000 Native Americans forced to relocate between 1830 and 1850, thousands, as many as around 20,000, died. Slightly later in the mission, Hosea gives Arthur some yarrow and ginseng and tells him that they're good for health. He's not wrong. Yarrow is native to Europe and Western Asia, but was naturalized in Australia, New Zealand, and North America. Its botanical name is said to be named after Achilles, the Greek mythical hero who used the herb to stop the bleeding wounds of his soldiers in the Trojan War of 1200 BCE. In medieval times, yarrow leaves were rolled up and stuffed into the nose to stop bleeding. Most similar to the in-game usage, however, yarrow was popular in European folk medicine for centuries, as it contains plant-based chemicals that help to support healthy digestion. In the game, yarrow replenishes Arthur's health and can be crafted into medicine, so its usage is fairly accurate. American ginseng, meanwhile, was discovered around 1716 in Montreal, Canada, and in the US it's native to the deciduous forests in the east. It was one of the earliest marketable herbs to be harvested in the country, becoming one of Minnesota's first major exports. In 1860, more than 120 tons of dried ginseng roots were shipped from Minnesota to China. In the US, pharmacists classed the herb as rather mild, but the Chinese apparently believed it to be powerful, so its success continued. The genus name, Panax, is derived from the Greek word panakia, meaning universal remedy. Not quite universal, as we'll discover later in the game, but it certainly helps to cure Arthur's health. By 1901, the price of the wild dried ginseng root was around $5 per pound, while the cultivator product was $9 to $9.50 per pound. A far cry from the 25 cents that you'll get for it in the game. But I guess at that price, all the gang had to do was find some ginseng in the wild and they'd have been in Tahiti in no time, so some changes to the economy had to be made somewhere. In Chapter 1 alone, even before leaving the snow and exploring the open world, Red Dead Redemption 2 makes its historical connections clear. Rockstar put so much effort into the game, its story and world, and these first 6 missions are a clear example of that. But now that we're out of the snow, we focus our attention on the livestock town of Valentine, and the historical connections just get more and more interesting.